Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, listeners. It's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. It's tick season. Stephanie Desmon sits down with Nicole Baumgarth, who runs the Johns Hopkins Lyme and Tick-Borne Diseases Research and Education Institute, to discuss why tick-borne illnesses are becoming more common, how you can protect yourself, and the latest in the vaccine and treatment pipelines. Let's listen. Nicole Baumgarth, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm very excited to be here.
So you are a tick expert, and it is tick season. I'm wondering if you could just sort of start with talking about how common ticks that carry viruses are and where we're seeing them.
Yes, well, they're actually unfortunately common and are getting more common. There are about 15 states in the United States that we consider ticks to be endemic. And we all know that in the upper Northeast, in particular, Connecticut, New York, Maryland, these areas are very heavily infested with ticks. But also California, which isn't really considered that heavily infested, we know that they are ticks. So they are present, they are there, and they're causing diseases by not only carrying viruses, as you said, they're also carrying bacteria and they're carrying parasites, and can cause all sorts of different human diseases.
So we are warned when we go out into the woods that we should protect ourselves. What should we do?
Yeah, it's unfortunately very boring, and we may look a little like dogs when we do it, but the best thing to do is to wear long sleeves, to wear socks, and actually put your long trousers into your socks, so you want to look even more doggy, and wear a hat. Any exposed skin, of course, is where ticks like to go and jump on you and start biting you.
I know that I go hiking in the woods and I don't do these things, but prevention is really all we have, isn't it?
Prevention currently is all we have. There are no vaccines available against any of the diseases that are carried by ticks. Of course, often when you see a tick, so one of the other things that's really important, if you didn't do what I just described, or you did it, but somehow you still got stuck with the tick, or a tick got stuck on you, you should check yourself at the end of the walk, and you can pull them off. Take a hot shower, take out your clothes and don't bring them inside. So those are things that you can do. But in terms of prevention from disease, unfortunately, no, we really have to be good about all these things that seem very boring and nobody really wants to do.
So when we hear ticks, we think first off about Lyme disease.
Yes.
Talk to us a little about Lyme disease and what the prevalence of that is.
Lyme disease is by far the most common vector-borne disease. So that includes infections by mosquitoes, which is actually surprising. 90% in the United States, 90% of all diseases that are caused by getting bitten by something is actually caused by ticks, which is quite surprising. So we don't know exactly how many people develop Lyme disease every year, but based on best evidence we have, the CDC recorded about 475,000 cases a year of Lyme disease, which is an amazing high number of cases. And one of the things that I think is important, that most people are really afraid of Lyme disease and have heard about cases of very long disease and ongoing symptoms. Lyme disease doesn't have to end like that. If it's diagnosed very rapidly, most people who then get treated with antibiotics will actually have the disease and then recover fully. However, about 10% or so of patients who get infected will not return to health. So that is still a really high number, right? That's up to about 45,000 individuals per year who will have ongoing symptoms for a while.
And that's, I think, where a lot of the fear of Lyme disease come from.
Absolutely. It's these cases where people may have not seen or noticed that they've been bitten. And because the symptoms of Lyme disease are so nonspecific, we talk about flu-like illnesses, of which there are so many. And when you don't have a tick, when you didn't know you had a tick, You may have missed the rash that sometimes develops, the so-called bullseye rash around the tick bite site. Now, for a doctor to determine that this is Lyme disease, is really hard. It's easier of course, in states like Connecticut, where people see it a lot. But if you have traveled somewhere and now return to your own state where that isn't common, that is really a big factor, is not to get diagnosed rapidly.
And so we talked about how they're becoming more common. I guess that they can live in the changing climate in different places. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, there are multiple reasons of why we think that there's an increased risk of tick-borne diseases. One is, as you said, with a warming climate, the ticks will actually move north. Our Canadian friends are actually particularly affected by this. There really was no Lyme disease in Canada even 20, 30 years ago. And now in the southern parts of Canada, just north of us, the ticks are now there. They didn't used to be able to overwinter, but now they can, and so they carry disease. So that is definitely a reason. The second one is that humans like to live where ticks like to live, which is sort of at the edges of the woods. And so we've moved out more into the countryside, more into these areas that are perfect habitat for ticks. So that also increases the risk, of course, of getting exposed to them. And then we have certain species of ticks that we haven't really seen that are now more common. I'm not sure we really fully understand why they are now expanding, but they seem to be doing quite well in the climates that we have. And this is, for example, the tick, it's called the Lone Star tick, that used to be only in the south. And now it's actually the most common tick found in Maryland.
And does that carry the same illnesses?
So the Lone Star tick does not carry Lyme disease. It carries some other, but the most common seen complication with amblyomma, the name of the Lone Star tick, are really two things. It's starry, which is also a sort of tick-borne illness, and then it's particularly concerning is an increase in allergies we develop from being bitten by a tick. That is sugar that is in the saliva and in the spit of the tick that you're exposed to when the tick is biting you. And it turns out that while we can't make this sugar that is inside the spit of the tick, it is actually a part of the red meat. And so if you're exposed to tick bite, you can become allergic to eating red meat. It's called the red meat allergy, and it can be life-threatening. It could be an allergic reaction. So you will be unable to eat red meat.
And that can happen after you're bitten by this tick. You used to be able to eat red meat, no problem, but now you're allergic to it. And it can be, as you said, it can have anaphylaxis as a result.
Yeah, it's very similar to what you have when you develop hay fever, right? Or other allergies. You may have no problems for 20 years or so, and all in a sudden, the spring comes and you start sneezing. And so you have to think about it very similarly to that.
So there are some other diseases that you are concerned about that you are investigating. Tell me.
I think there are some that are actually a little scary. So these are viruses. Lyme disease is caused by a bacterium. There are viruses that are also transmitted by ticks. One is called Powassan virus. Another one is called Heartland virus. They're both viruses against which we have no treatments. They can cause diseases you can get very ill by these, including meningitis, tick-borne encephalitis virus, for example. People are known to have died from that. These are usually people that have other problems. They're not usually fully healthy, but it's very scary to get bitten by a tick and then maybe acquire a virus that nobody's really a cure for. So you can just treat the symptoms, but you can't actually treat the infection. And so we're very concerned about that. The other disease that seems to become more common is called babesiosis. That is actually a little parasite that lives inside red blood cells. The reason why this is concerning is the diagnosis is actually one of the more easier ones because you can find these parasites in your red blood cells quite easily. But if the blood supply is not studied, if it's not tested for babesiosis, there have been infections caused by blood transfer. So we are now much better about testing for that. That is And the other is if a pregnant woman is infected with Babesia, she may not have any symptoms, but at birth, during birth, she may transfer the infection to the neonate. And these are, of course, they're not immunocompetent, so they can get very sick. Those are the two instances where we are really worried about it, because the blood supply is usually given to people that have an illness and a lot of blood, and their immune system is also compromised.
So the blood supply is now checked for this?
Yes.
So let's talk about a vaccine. Are we near a vaccine? I understand there's different ways to go about creating a vaccine. What can you tell me?
Yeah, so they are phase 3 clinical trials going on, so very far down the line. This is now testing for efficacy, testing how well there's actually protection from Lyme disease. This is a vaccine that is against the bug that causes Lyme disease, and actually not the bug as it is in our body, but actually as it is in the tick. And the idea is that you make antibodies to that antigen that is expressed by the bug in the tick. And the tick will pick up the antibodies with a blood meal and actually prevent that bug from ever infecting you, which seems like a perfect way of doing it. There are some problems with that approach. But if we make a lot of antibodies, then that is a very good way of protecting us. So actually a very similar vaccine, slightly different, but it's on the market in around 2000, and then was put off the market, not because it wasn't working, but because of with other concerns. So that is sort of treating one disease after another. And you can envisage that with enough resources, people may develop vaccines against other pathogens that are transmitted by ticks. But one more newer idea that I think is actually very exciting is to think about, can we develop a vaccine against a tick bite? So can we vaccinate ourselves against ticks in general, right? And so the idea would be that the moment a tick starts biting you, to develop an immune response and expel the tick from the skin. If that could work, then it doesn't matter what pathogen they carry, right? We would not actually get infected. So I think that is definitely exciting. We're years away from doing it, but the kind of basic research that is currently going on is trying to figure out how to do this.
That sounds really amazing. So I guess one last question I want to leave you with is, we can't talk about science lately without talking about budget cuts. And I'm wondering if your tick work or other tick work is being impacted by funding cuts.
Yeah, unfortunately, it has been. There have been cuts to earmarked funding to support tick-borne disease work, mainly Lyme disease research. There was a pot of about $7 million a year that was given out by the medical research supported by the Department of Defense that has a particular interest in protecting soldiers and their families from illnesses. Money is gone, and it allowed about funding of about 7 grants or so every year, specifically earmarked for research on tick-borne diseases. So that's very unfortunate, and we really hope that that might be reinstated. The other money that seems to be gone is there was a public-private partnership between the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation and the NIH, where there was the idea to develop better diagnostics, and there was multiple rounds. And as I said, it was a private-public partnership, and it seems that the office that gave out the public part of that partnership was actually cut, and so there's no partner anymore to that. So it was called Lyme X, that initiative, and again, we are hoping that that was a mistake and it will be reinstated.
As a tick researcher, this has to feel like a tricky time.
It is a tricky time, and I think it's not just as a tick researcher, just as a researcher in general. It's a little hard to know what the priorities are. And we, of course, when we do our research, it's decades that we work on that, right? I've been working on tick-borne diseases now for 20 years. And research is incredibly slow and painstaking and step by step. And so it's always fantastic to talk about breakthroughs. But, it's a little bit of a misnomer, because it's more of a crawling than actually a breaking through. And if you can't know that there's continued support, it's hard to keep going. And it takes money to even keep going. Interrupting research is very difficult. You have students working on it. And it's frustrating too, because we want to make progress. I have to say that working on Lyme disease is something that I started it because I was interested in the immunology underlying the disease. But really, there are so many people affected and there's so few resources we have. So we really need to keep going. We cannot allow this to just stop, even for a few years.
Nicole Baumgarth, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmon, and Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.